Hello, my name is Brock Hollett. Many of you know me as the author of Debunking Preterism, How Over-Realized Eschatology Misses the Not Yet of Bible Prophecy. Several of our close friends have recently embraced a radical interpretation of Daniel chapter 8. This interpretation denies that any part of the prophecy was adequately accounted for in history, and it places the fulfillment of the entire chapter in our future. This interpretation was recently popularized about a month ago in the Understanding the Times conference that was held in Tyler, Texas. Those who teach this new interpretation insist that the nation of Iran will soon invade other parts of the Middle East, and in turn that the nation of Turkey will destroy Iran. Now, according to this view, Turkey's king will then die, Turkey will break up into 4 kingdoms, and the final Antichrist will emerge from one of those 4 kingdoms before taking over the entire region. Now, it's important for us to recognize that this interpretation of Daniel 8 is a radical departure from any interpretive tradition throughout the history of Christianity. Now, several of my close friends, including Travis Bennett and Reggie Kelly of the ministry known as the Mystery of Israel, have shared my concerns about this new interpretation, and we have discussed these concerns with each other in detail. In this short video, I will demonstrate that this novel interpretation is faulty and inherently dangerous for Christians to embrace. Before we evaluate this interpretation, we want to emphasize that the people who have embraced it are our Christian brothers and sisters. We also share the same general position on eschatology, that is, historic premillennialism. And we also reject John Nelson Darby's teaching that the church will be raptured before the Great Tribulation. We also agree with our friends that the Great and Unprecedented Tribulation will begin when the final Antichrist invades Jerusalem and places his image in the Jerusalem temple. This Great Tribulation will continue for 3.5 years and will end at the day of the Lord, at which time the Son of God will return in glory to bring wrath upon his enemies, to destroy the Antichrist, and to reign with his saints upon the earth for 1,000 years. In addition, we agree with them that the Antichrist will soon descend upon Israel from the north, and he will likely emerge from an Islamic nation. Now we will evaluate the prophetic vision of Daniel chapter 8. When we look at the chapter, verses 1 through 8 describe the first portion of the vision, in which the prophet saw a ram with 2 horns of different lengths, and a goat with 1 prominent horn. Verses 6 and 7 tells us that the goat charged the ram from the west and broke off its 2 horns. Verse 8 tells us that the prominent horn of the goat was later broken off, and that 4 prominent horns arose in its place and towards the 4 winds of heaven. Verse 9 and following depict a little horn that grew up out of the place of one of the 4. This little horn became exceedingly great and set up the abomination of desolation, as seen in verses 11 and 12. The interpretation of this vision is then provided in verses 15 and following, and it reveals in verses 20 and 21 that the ram represents the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat symbolizes the king of Greece, literally Javan. The prominent horn of the goat symbolizes the first king of Javan, and the 4 horns that replaced it represent 4 successive kingdoms. The historic church has always, and I repeat, always understood this to be describing the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great and its rapid fall by the Macedonian armies of Alexander the Great. In other words, the Greek Empire of the ancient world. History tells us that Alexander died suddenly and his kingdom was divided among his generals, the Diadochi. 4 of the emerging kingdoms eventually won out by the completion of the Battle of Ipsus, or soon thereafter. As the prophecy indicates, these 4 kingdoms were divided to the 4 winds of heaven: Seleucid to the north and east, Lysimachus to the north and west, Ptolemy to the southwest, and Cassandri to the west, all with respect to the Holy Land. The little horn, who had become exceedingly great and set up the abomination of desolation in verses 9 and following, would emerge from one of these 4 regions. We agree at this point with our friends on this. This little horn is the same little horn that is depicted in the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 7. And we agree with them that he is the final Antichrist. And we, like most of our friends, see only one abomination of desolation mentioned throughout the Bible. The prophet Daniel was also to understand that the vision of this chapter pertained to the time of the end, verse 17, the latter end of the indignation or wrath in verse 19, the appointed time of the end, verse 19, and many days from now, verse 26. Now we will demonstrate that the novel interpretation of our friends is faulty. We contend that verses 1 through 8 were fulfilled in ancient history, and that they set the stage for the predictions about the Antichrist in verses 9 and following. Our friends object to this approach, arguing that the time indicators contained within the prophecy require that the entire prophecy be fulfilled at the time of the end. However, this demand is unnecessary, and it betrays an ignorance of how the prophets wrote about future events. Prophecy teacher John Wolford, in his commentary on Daniel, wrote, quote, "In attempting the difficult exegesis of this portion of Scripture, the general principle should be observed that prophecy, as far as it goes, is accurate, but that prophecy is selective. The revelation does not contain all the history of the period, nor name all the rulers. It is not always possible to determine why some facts are included and others are excluded." Now, I believe that was with reference to Daniel chapter 11, but the point still holds with what we're speaking of. Now, our friends also argue that Alexander the Great was not the first king of the Greek Empire, as supposedly demanded by verse 21. Joel Richardson, for example, points out that Alexander was not the first king of Javan, but the 23rd king. However, we need to understand that biblical prophecy is not interested in including, like Wolver just said, comprehensive lists of every intermediate ruler. Instead, lists often express selectivity, as the commentators acknowledge, and other passages of Scripture demonstrate. One example of this selectivity can be seen in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 11, where specific kings and large portions of royal history are skipped over. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 21, the Hebrew word translated first can mean foremost, or first in a series of time, space, or set. Alexander was first in prominence. He was, after all, called the Great. Daniel 11, verse 3, appears to support this approach. Alexander was also first in the series of horns seen by the prophet in the vision. Finally, Alexander reigned over the first form of government, the United Macedonian Empire, which was followed by 4 Hellenic empires after its fourfold division. In addition, when we examine Daniel chapter 10, verse 20, we find that the heavenly man clothed in linen would immediately defeat the demonic prince of Persia and remove him to make way for the prince of Javan in verse 20. Now, just a few verses later, in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, we see that the mighty king of Javan would appear after 4 more Persian kings had arisen. This proves that the Persian kings were already in power at the time of Daniel's vision, and that Alexander the Great could be identified as the mighty king, whose kingdom would be divided into 4 parts in verses 3 and 4. These descriptions demonstrate that the heavenly princes of Persia and Greece and their contemporary earthly counterparts pertain to the ancient world. Now we will examine another important reason why our friend's interpretation is incorrect. One of the primary keys to unlocking the sealed visions of Daniel is the hermeneutical principle of intertextuality. Intertextuality is using Scripture to interpret Scripture. Our friends agree with us about the paramount importance of this principle as it pertains to correctly understanding and deciphering the book of Daniel. But this is precisely where their interpretation unravels. For example, the fourfold division of the Greek kingdom in Daniel chapter 8 is elsewhere prophesied in the description of the leopard beast with 4 wings and 4 heads in Daniel chapter 7. In order to maintain interpretive consistency, our friends must interpret this third beast, the leopard beast, as describing a future kingdom, and many of them identify this beast as modern Turkey. However, the many literary parallels within the prophecies of Daniel provide strong evidence that the third beast kingdom of Daniel 7 is also the third kingdom of bronze in Nebuchadnezzar's statue in Daniel chapter 2. This same thematic overlap can also be seen by comparing the fourth and final kingdom as found in these 2 visions. For example, the fourth beast's iron teeth that devoured and broke in pieces and stamped everything in chapter 7 parallel the iron of the fourth part of the statue that breaks to pieces and shatters everything in chapter 2. In addition, the 10 horns of the fourth beast in chapter 7 equate with the toes of the statue in chapter 2. Other parallels can be cited. On this basis, it is no wonder that virtually every Jewish and Christian commentator equates the leopard kingdom of chapter 7 with the third kingdom of bronze in chapter 2 and identifies it with the ancient kingdom of Greece. As we know from chapter 2, this historical kingdom of bronze followed the silver kingdom of Media-Persia, which in turn followed the gold head, which the prophecy itself identifies as King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of ancient, not modern, Babylon. Consequently, intertextuality demonstrates the inconsistency of our friend's interpretation of Daniel 8. Let's take this principle of intertextuality in a different direction. The fourfold division of the kingdom of Javan is also described in detail in Daniel 11, verses 2 through 4. Consequently, in order to maintain consistency, our friend's interpretation forces them to place the fulfillment of the entire 11th chapter of Daniel into our future. However, this interpretation ignores the remarkable fulfillment of verses 1 through 19 in ancient history. They must gloss over the events that were prophesied in these verses and took place in ancient history, including the many detailed battles between the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires and the arranged marriages, the royal marriages that were done for political purposes that are also found in these verses. Now, to be fair, some of our friends do argue that these verses were fulfilled to a lesser degree in history. However, their interpretation requires that these royal marriages happen again in contemporary history. This would take decades and more likely over a century for development. This robs the church of our prophetic urgency. Simply put, if their interpretation is correct, Jesus cannot come back for several decades. Another flaw with their interpretation is that it requires a long series of other military developments, as prophesied in Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 8. For example, it would require Iran to expand militarily into the Middle East. It would require Turkey to retaliate and destroy Iran's forces. It would require Turkey to later divide into 4 new kingdoms, and only after all this would the Antichrist emerge to solidify the kingdom in the region. This scenario would require a significant amount of time. In addition, verse 4 states that Persia would invade to its west, north, and south. If this were to happen in our immediate future, it would mean that Iran must invade Iraq and possibly Syria, despite the presence of U.S. and Russian forces there. It would also mean that Iran must expand northward. These are nations that belong to the former Soviet Union, an action that today's Russia would not allow, given its military entrance and its formidable presence in the region. Their interpretation here must require significant geopolitical changes as well. Finally, verse 7 reveals that no military would be able to stand before the kingdom of Javan. Although this certainly was the case with Alexander's Macedonian Empire, modern Turkey is no match for the military prowess of Russia, China, or the United States, and possibly Israel, just to name a few. You may be wondering, why does it matter if we misinterpret Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 8? If the church begins to look for a future fulfillment of this portion of the prophecy, verses which were completely fulfilled in ancient history, we contend, we will be looking at the wrong places and events. Consequently, we will not be able to correctly discern the times in which we live. If this occurs, the church will become confused, and our prophetic testimony will suffer as a result. In addition, this interpretation would likely cause us to miss some crucial maneuvers of the Antichrist. This could be very disarming for the church in the coming days. In addition, this interpretation denies the predictive value of the prophecy as found in history, and it could result in the world of biblical scholarship dismissing our entire position of Bible prophecy without proper consideration of facts. Now we will summarize how we should understand the prophecies of Daniel chapter 8 and the other prophecies of the book of Daniel. We see the first 8 verses of Daniel 8 as having been entirely fulfilled in ancient history, and we recognize a gap between verses 8 and 9, with verses 9 and following taking place at the time of the end. We agree with our friends that Daniel 8 verses 9 and following is concerned with the final Antichrist. Our interpretive approach is consistent with the chronological gaps found in all the other prophecies of Daniel. For example, our friends agree with us that there is a gap at some point in Daniel 2, although we differ somewhat about where this occurs in the prophecy. We also agree with them that there is another gap between the cutting off of the Messiah in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, and the final week of years in chapter 9, verse 27. And this interpretation is consistent with the overwhelming number of early church fathers. Our interpretation strongly favors the recognition of a similar gap in all of Daniel's end-time prophecies. This includes a gap beginning with Daniel 11, verse 20 or 21. Notice that many, if not most, evangelical Christians do not place the gap until chapter 11, verse 36, a view that we and our friends reject. All of this means that we see the Antichrist portion of the prophecy beginning much earlier than most evangelicals do. This interpretation, by the way, is very defensible. Joel Richardson, after learning of this interpretation from our mutual mentor, Reggie Kelly, has defended the futurity of this portion of the prophecy, as I do in my book, Debunking Preterism. Now, to be fair to our friends, they are sometimes careful to say that Daniel 8 could be fulfilled typologically in history, as prophetically foreshadowing future events. However, they betray these very statements when they assert that the details of the prophecy do not fit historical events. And as we have demonstrated in this video, any future fulfillment of Daniel 8 verses 1 through 8 forces many unlikely and at times untenable interpretations of the other prophecies of Daniel. Joel Richardson, in episode 115 of his online broadcast, The Underground, makes this statement regarding our friend's interpretation of Daniel 8. He says this interpretation is what I suggested 15 years ago, and what I still think is a very solid option. Let me say this, I'm not 100% convinced that this is the case, but I think it is very solid interpretation. I always encourage caution. I say don't jump, and I say let's look. So if that's the case, we have one of the most precise countdowns, if you will, to the Antichrist. It is incredible. We should be paying attention to all these things. That said, I am convinced that it is a good, solid option. I'm not 100% convinced. It's possible that all Gabriel meant is that in Daniel 8, 1 through 8 bleeds into the last days. I don't think that's what it is saying, but it is possible. We need to be so careful when it comes to future speculative eschatology to think that we have it all figured out. We need to come to these things with humility. I tell you, it's very rare to see this within the world of Bible prophecy. Everyone loves to sort of act like they know the future, and guys, we don't know the future. You don't know the future. I don't know the future. End quote. We agree with Brother Richardson's admonition that we should proceed with caution and humility when we approach these holy prophecies. We plead with our friends and our viewers to revisit Daniel 8 and to pull back from this novel interpretation. And by God's grace, we will be the Maskelyne who will proclaim the unsealed scroll of Daniel's prophecies to the Jewish people and to the nations before the return of Jesus Christ.